Hello, geographers, economic geographers. Today we are going to talk about Mexico, and I wanted to use Mexico as an example of how an economy can develop, decline, grow, decline again. So, the study of geography, as you all know, is the study of spatial relationships. It's a study of how humans adapt to their physical geography. And so, specifically, when we study economic geography, we're looking at how the economy is shaped by the natural landscape and adapted by humans. So let's take Mexico as an example because Mexico is right next door to us. California used to be part of Mexico, and many of us are Mexican. City College is something like 40% Latinx. So besides our proximity and maybe our personal ties to Mexico, it's a good place for us to understand in more depth, because what often happens when we are close to a place, just like when we're close to a person or close to a subject, is we hear all these different cultural concepts without really understanding how and where Mexico has been. So we are using Mexico as a case study today and how an economy develops, how it develops around its physical geography, how it's affected by colonization, and how it's affected by globalization. So let's share our screen. All right, so we're looking at Mexico and the economy. And first I have a quote for you. This quote is not from a Mexican person, but that's all right. It's a good quote since this is my second to last lecture. Next week, I'm going to talk about the development of urbanization and urban geography and how that relates to economy and culture. So, I wish I could show you when you are lonely or in darkness the astonishing light of your own being. Thought that was a good quote for our isolation and also because we're nearing the end of the semester and this time with you. So here's Mexico, in case you were not clear on where it was. First thing in understanding anything about geography is understanding the physical geography. So in geography, we understand and study spatial relationships, but the basis of geographic study is that the natural landscape, which is a product of climate and geology and vegetation, which vegetation is also a product of climate and geology, and time. So if we take those three big things, geology, climate, and vegetation, and give it a whole bunch of time, now we have our natural landscape, our fluvial geography, our mountains, our valleys, our floodplains, our biogeography, plants and animals, and how they've adapted to that natural landscape. So in understanding anything about geography, whether it's the economy, whether it's religion, whether it's language, we need to look at the physical geography of the place. So this is Mexico right here. And Mexico, as I'm sure you know, is connected to the rest of Central America, and Central America is going to come up in this talk as well. So it's good that you know the location of different countries like Guatemala, for example. El Salvador is this little skinny country right here. Honduras has been the murder capital of the world on and off for the last decade. And then here is Mexico. And Mexico, if we were to look at this entire region, sometimes called the Middle American region, Mexico would be the outlier when it comes to economy, political power, size, population, all that stuff. So let's look at our physical geography. So Mexico is a good sized country compared to other countries in the world, and especially in this region, but it's nowhere close to the size of the US, it's nowhere close to the size of China, to India, to our very, very large countries in the world, or even to the other countries that are part of North America, the other countries being the US and Canada. Canada is the second biggest country in the world, and the US is third. So when we look at Mexico, we're looking at a good-sized country. We're looking at a country that is mostly in the low latitudes. Now, I've mentioned this term before all throughout the semester, the low latitudes. That's 0 to 30 degrees north and south of the equator. And if we look around the low latitudes in the world, we're looking at the tropics. We're looking at an area that's dominated climate-wise by a surplus of sun, a surplus of the sun's energy, a whole lot of low pressure systems, which low pressure leads to rain. So you're looking at an area that is lush, that is going to be very wet for the most part. You're going to have a whole lot of rain. You're going to have a whole lot of biodiversity all around the low latitudes. But we also know from this class that the low latitudes tend to be the poorest countries in the world. And if you remember, we talked about that as a result of the kinds of plants that you grow there, that we grow staples in the mid latitudes, things like rice, things like corn, things like wheat, those grow in the mid latitudes. What grows in the low latitudes are things like coffee, sugar, bananas, all things that are important, but they're not staples. And so this part of the world became very interesting to Europeans about 400 years ago. So about 400 years ago, we have the beginning of European colonization. My dog's barking. Let me pause this. Okay, sorry. My dog's been barking all day. So if we look at things like, okay, sorry, we're talking about Europe. So about 400 years ago, 500 years ago, this becomes a very important place to Europe. Europe is in the mid latitudes, so they can grow wheat really well. They have good access to water, both for trade, both for fresh water. They have good soil. They have good coal. That's about it. So they were usually at a trade deficit with the rest of the world. If you remember me saying this throughout the semester, they traded with Africa, they traded with East Asia, with South Asia for a very long time. And usually they wanted more from East Asia, South Asia, and Africa than they had to trade. That's a trade deficit. So they made up for that in different ways. One way was to control Southwest Asia, control Istanbul, right, the Bosphorus Strait, control the Mediterranean, control different parts of the basically the land bridge in between Europe, Africa, and East Asia. Another thing was the British, for example, they wanted tea from China. And at one point they sent somebody in and that person stole tea. So they stole a tea plant. They brought it into South Asia. They started growing it in South Asia, and that leads to the British Raj, the British control of South Asia, because of to dominate the trade of tea in the world. So eventually, as you know, Columbus makes his way down to the Caribbean and then to South America accidentally, thinks he's going to South Asia. And then Europeans are like, yay, this is an area that we would like to control, because all the things that we want to trade with the rest of the world are things that come from the low latitudes. Why don't we just control the low latitudes instead of having to trade with the low latitudes? Let's control the low latitudes. Let's control places where we can grow sugar and tobacco and all the stuff we can't grow in the mid latitudes in Europe. So when we look at the physical geography of this area in relation to the economy, and in the last 500 years, first thing is, because it was in the low latitudes, it became a place that people wanted to control. People from the mid latitudes wanted to control. They wanted to control the resources because they didn't have access to them in the mid latitudes. That led to cultural annihilation. It led to genocide. The Arawak people who lived in the Caribbean fought, were killed, mostly. So the majority of people would have been killed. Some people fought, some people left, but you have the annihilation of all of the indigenous cultures of the US. The majority of the population would have eventually been decimated by disease and other things. But you have the beginning of that starting with the Arawak people. And then you have the introduction of laborers. So what I'm talking about with European colonization and how the physical geography plays a role in this whole area is you have this place that's in the low latitudes that people want to control for their resources. They go in and they annihilate the cultures that are there already. But they want this area because of the resources that you can plant. Also, they find a lot of gold and a lot of silver in Mexico. So this now becomes this area where, hey, you can grow things that you can't grow in the mid latitudes, and there's a lot of gold and there's a lot of silver. These people are using it for nothing. They're using it for art when we should be melting it down and turning it into bricks, because that's what's really valuable. So when we look at this physical geography and what leads to the mineral and the agricultural resources, it's kind of the beginning of a whole lot of issues for this region. Not kind of, it is the beginning of a whole lot of issues for this region, where Europeans come and begin to colonize. You see the annihilation of people, And you see the introduction of new people. So the mining of gold and silver, as well as the types of agricultural pursuits, tobacco, sugar, those are things that are very, very labor intensive. So what happens is Europeans who start to colonize here can't use the labor here very much because the labor is either fighting, running, or dying. So they start to introduce new workers, indentured servants, very, very poor people from Europe. Europe had plenty of poor people. Europe, if you remember me saying this, Europe is an area that's pretty small. Until the Industrial Revolution, it was an economy that was based on land ownership, which means that wealth was pretty finite and very few people were very wealthy and the majority of people were pretty poor. So when you now need laborers in this part of the world, a lot of those laborers came from the very, very poor people in Europe. But the types of economies that were developing in this part of the world were so labor intensive that there weren't enough poor people, political prisoners, indentured servants in Europe to even fill the demands for this. So they start importing Africans. It leads to the enslavement of Africans and the involuntary movement of Africans from West Africa, from what's now Angola, to the Caribbean, and then to Mexico and Central America, and as you know, eventually to the rest of the Americas. And that's our cultural upheaval and creation of new cultures and all of that stuff that's going to become as a result of the physical geography that leads to an economic demand that leads to the upheaval, annihilation of one culture, and the introduction of new cultures. So when we look at this physical geography, God, Gingy. So looking at a deeper dive into just the physical geography. So we just looked at the kinds of plants that you can grow, the things that you can mine, but let's just look at Mexico itself. So Mexico is an area that's dominated by desert. So we have what are called the true desert regions in the world. If you look between 20 and 40 degrees north and south of the equator, those are what we call the true desert regions of the world. So think about where the Sahara Desert is, the Gobi, the Kalahari, the Great Victorian, the Sonoran Desert, the Atacama Desert. They're all in between 20 and 40 degrees north and south of the equator. And that's because of the Hadley cell, which is a convection cell that originates in the equator. You have a low pressure system that leads to a whole lot of rain and sorry. Okay, so our true desert regions, you have the Hadley cell, you have this low pressure cell over the equator. That low pressure cell leads to a lot of rain, and there's a surplus of the sun's energy at the equator. But when that air rises up over the equator, it condenses, that's why it rains, and it stops rising because now it's cooler, so it's not rising anymore. And it gets pulled back down to the surface of the earth by gravity. It doesn't pull back directly where it rose up. So if it's rising around the equator, it falls about 20 to 40 degrees north and south of the equator because air has mass. So it's constantly rising over the equator and then it condenses and it can't just fall right back down because there's another mass of air coming up behind it. So what happens is it falls right where the Sonoran Desert is. So the Sonoran Desert and that whole latitude around the world is getting hit with this dry, warm air that originated as wet, warm air around the equator, dropped all of its water, and then came back down around the Sonoran Desert with dry air. So a lot of Mexico is dominated by a gigantic, very hot desert. You also have mountains. So a dominant feature in Mexico is going to be the Sierra Madres. And there's actually 3 different mountain ranges that are part of the Sierra Madres. And they go down along the side of Mexico, the western side, the eastern side, and then right in the middle. So when we look at Mexico as its physical geography in general, it's not actually that welcoming of a place when it comes to living in the majority of the country. The places where you're going to see it be more welcoming to population would be the Yucatan Peninsula. So down here, this little part of Mexico that comes up northward. And those are lowlands, they're flat. And the Yucatan Peninsula is an interesting place I'm going to get into in just a minute. So you've got the Yucatan Peninsula here, where you're going to have a lot of heat. You're going to have a lot of, you're not going to yet be into that desert belt. So it's still going to be rising air and a whole lot of humidity, a whole lot of water. And then you have some valleys in here. If you can see, this is green. And then over here on the other side of the Sierras, so on one side of the Sierras, the Sierra Madres, the western side and the eastern side. And then we have Mexico City. And Mexico City is right in the middle of a valley. So we've got the majority of Mexico, mountains, desert, but then we have these valleys, and that's where we're going to see the majority of the population. So first, pre-colonial Mexico was dominated, I'm sure you know, I'm sure you've heard of the Maya. So the Maya lived here in the Yucatan Peninsula. They started at about 750 BCE, and their decline is in the 9th century. So before Europeans ever got there, the Maya had already declined, and that civilization had ended. And it had probably ended because of climate change and because of takeovers from the Aztec, or from what eventually became the Aztec. They developed art, they've developed architecture, math, they had a calendar, they had advanced astronomy. Their economy was based on agriculture and land ownership. I mean, look, this is, like I said, this is going to be your lowlands. You can see that it's green. You have a whole lot of rain. Plus, you have the added benefits of, I'll come right back to this, of these limestone caverns. So what's happening in the Yucatan is covered in limestone, or I should say that the foundation is limestone. So limestone is a type of rock that is easily erodible by water and a little bit of carbon. So what we call carbonic acid. So if you imagine you have rain that falls on the soil stores carbon from the air, like trees, they're out here, they've got their leaves out. Those leaves breathe in carbon dioxide, they separate the oxygen and put that back into the atmosphere, and they take the carbon and they sequester it in soil. So when water from raindrops runs through the soil, it picks up and absorbs that carbon, giving it a slightly acidic quality. Now, we wouldn't notice that acid, but limestone does, because limestone is particularly vulnerable to carbonic acid. So when that water that now has a little bit of carbon runs over limestone, it very easily erodes it, so that you have these huge underground caverns that now become storage areas for fresh water. And that is happening all under the Yucatan. So all through here, we have these like gigantic freshwater caverns, because again, of the physical geography. The physical geography with the limestone being vulnerable to carbonic acid, that water goes through the soil, absorbs carbon, runs over limestone, and creates these huge caverns that become storage areas for fresh water. If you know anything about human settlements, it always has to be around fresh water. So one of our very oldest civilizations, of the 5 oldest civilizations in the world, one of them is the Maya. And it has everything to do with, it's the only civilization, by the way, first civilization that develops in the low latitudes. And that's because of this. It's because of the Yucatan Peninsula and the humongous caverns of limestone that hold all of this fresh water. So their economy was based on agriculture and land ownership, just like Mesopotamia, just like China, just like the Indus River Valley, all those first civilizations in the world. And like I said, they're the only major civilization in the lowland tropics. Their real pinnacle, the highest point of their civilization between the 3rd and the 10th centuries, like I said, about 2 to 3 million people lived there. So they were supporting a population of about 3 million people at one point. They were based on dynasties. A dynasty is kind of a natural economy and political system that's going to result from having an agricultural economy. When you own when your economy is based on land ownership, just like we've talked about in Europe, the people who own more land become the wealthy people, and those wealthy people become the heads of the political systems. That's what leads to a monarchy, right? That's why Europe, for so long, their political system was dominated by a monarchy. It was because their economy was based on land ownership. So the more land you own, the more powerful you are economically, you end up being the political power as well. Same thing here in the lowland Yucatan with the Maya. They also had a religious hierarchy, which was linked to their monarchies, and that's something that we see in other parts of the world too, right? The idea that the monarchy, the kings and the queens, are somehow appointed by God or related to God. The ruins today of the Maya are still something that's very present in Central America and in the Yucatan. If you've never been, you should definitely go at one point in your life. So we know, like I said, that you had a whole lot of different things that you could grow because they were in the lowlands and because of the fresh water. But they became known for trade of like textile goods, like clothing and cloth and stuff like that, because of their ability to grow cotton in that part of Mexico, what's now Mexico. They had a good textile industry. They had a writing and recording system, which is one of the reasons that we know something about the Maya today. And like I said, they studied astronomy. So they declined, and we're not sure why exactly they declined. It might be because if you have a dynasty, inevitably, if a dynasty is going to be a system, like a multiple system of monarchies, and anytime you have that over a long period of time, because power stays in a family, you have some incest, you have some hostile takeovers. A dynasty is kind of easier to split apart in some ways. A monarchy is can be easy to split apart, but a dynasty can be too, because it relies on a collection of families. So if you get in with one family and then we have this divide, that might be why. So then the next big political economic power in Mexico are the Aztec. And the Aztec come later after the Maya. They were fierce warriors. They had political dominance over their empire. They were a hydraulic civilization. So that's a little bit different than what we talked about with the Maya, where the Maya controlled land, the Aztec controlled water. And that's another way that we see your kind of beginning civilizations. One comes from control of land, the other comes from control of water. It depends on what you have, which one is more finite. If we're in Hawaii, for example, the Polynesians in Hawaii, the Hawaiians, their monarchy and political and economic control was based again on controlling water, because Hawaii is a series of islands. You have something called orographic lifting, which leads to a wet side of the island and a dry side of the island. So if you control the wet side, you control the whole island. See? So that's what a hydraulic civilization is. And also the Aztec were in a big valley. Mexico City today, that's where the Aztec were, are in the middle of this big valley. And that valley is on a lake, and it has a humongous underground aquifer. Aquifer is an underground storage place for water, basically, underground lake or river. So they had this natural barrier of the mountains. They were in the valley. They were able to control water in the valley, and they became this military power. They were based in agriculture, in trade, and then in tribute. Now, if you know, think what would another word for tribute be? Taxes, right? This is one of the ways that you get your population to pay into your government and to pay into the power of your political system, is through taxes. So one way that we facilitate taxes is through tribute. It's not exactly the same as how we do taxes here today. It has to do with this kind of, let's say, internalized idea in a culture about kind of a social hierarchy and paying tribute to that social hierarchy. It's another way, basically, to get taxes from your population. So the Aztec, sorry, this is the Maya again. These are our underground limestone caverns full of water. And then that's Chichen Itza, which is one of the ruins today. Tikal is another one in Guatemala. Tulum in the southern, that's near Cancun. So our Aztecs, the Highland Aztecs, so the lowland Maya, the Highland Aztecs, they were an organized state. And like I said, their population was very big. They thrived in urban areas. They had specific irrigation systems. Remember, they were a hydraulic civilization. Their agriculture, corn, which is a staple, sweet potatoes, which would have come from the Andes. So that would have been from trade with the Inca. Beans, tomatoes come from Guatemala, modern day Guatemala. So again, that would have been a result of a trade network. Squash, cacao. Cacao comes from the rainforest, so that would have been a result of trade with, again, with the Inca, which is a civilization in South America. And then tobacco, which comes from all over North America. So our Aztecs, our next big power. And so just to give you an idea of where the Aztecs were, their trade network. So Mexico City is right here. This is where the big valley would have been. And that would have been the extent of their imperial empire, but not necessarily their imperial empire, their united empire, but not necessarily their trade network. And then if you've seen Aztec architecture or art or anything, this might look familiar. That would be kind of your quintessential Aztec art. So that is our pre-colonial economy of Mexico. Now let's look at the Spanish conquest. So the Spaniards get there, and like I said, I just explained like why the Spanish, the Portuguese, other Europeans wanted to control parts of the Americas, because basically you could get things from there and grow things there that you couldn't get and grow in Europe. And they come into, so the Aztecs were these warriors, and like I said, they had this physical barrier. And so the people who actually end up controlling and taking over the Aztecs, Cortez and his whole band of merry colonists, come in, and they're actually invited in. So the reason that they were successful is they attacked from the inside. So they had been invited in by the head of the Aztecs, so the head of the Aztec Empire. They were living for a month inside the castle walls, and they were basically creating a trade agreement. And so Spain had wanted to, they come across this unified empire, and they're like, all right, this isn't going to be like the Arawaks who we can chase away and just murder. This is going to be somebody we're going to have to trade with. Their military power is going to more equally match our military power as a result of access to things like iron and different metals, and et cetera, et cetera. So we have this month-long kind of treaty of trade that's happening between the Aztec and the Spanish. And the thing that they kind of butt heads on, so they have all these different terms of trade that they come up with, and they're basically like hammering out all of this trade between Spain and the Aztecs. But what they can't agree on is Catholicism. So the Spanish are like, and you have to become Catholic if we're going to do business with you. And the Aztecs were like, sure, because they were polytheist. So in polytheism, one of the beauties of polytheism when you're trying to take over parts of the world is that you just take over people's gods too, and they become collected into your gods. If you have many gods in your religion, you can continue to add more and more and more gods. That's why polytheism was this brilliant part of pre-European colonization. It was used as a tactic for empire building before we really see Europeans start to go out and take over the world with monotheism. So Montezuma is like, sure, bring in Catholicism, we'll add it to our hill of deities. And the Spanish are like, no, you don't get it. There's just Catholicism. And the Aztecs are like, yeah, sure, Catholicism, we'll add it. And the Spanish are like, no, this is it. And that's where they eventually butt heads. And that's why the Spanish decide to attack the Aztecs, and they attack them from inside. So it's kind of like a Trojan horse, except they don't have to hide inside a horse to get into the castle walls. They're already in there, and they attack in the middle of the night. So you have the 16th century Spanish defeat of the Aztecs. They enslaved many of the indigenous people. A lot of people would have died because of diseases and because of harsh treatment and stuff like that. You have the introduction of different animals at this period. So cattle, sheep, things that come from Southwest Asia originally. Cattle come from Southwest Asia as well as from different parts of Europe and Central Asia. Sheep come from Southwest Asia. And then crops from Europe like wheat and all of these other things. So Mexico, parts of Mexico are just north enough that you can grow these staples, things like corn, things like wheat. And you have the restructuring of land, you have the restructuring of people, and you have a class system that's based on European heritage being at the top and indigenous people being at the bottom. And you have the introduction of African slaves. Mexico enslaved people just like every European, or not, Mexico, just like every other American country, had at least some period of enslavement. Now, it wasn't necessarily institutionalized like we see here. Canada, for example, had enslaved Africans as well. Mexico and Canada were two countries that got rid of enslaved Africans. So specifically the enslavement of Africans very early, long before Brazil or before other countries, before Jamaica, before the US. But we still see the introduction of Africans. So you have, during the Spanish period of colonization, the introduction of this hierarchy that favors Europeans and has indigenous people and Africans down at the bottom. And you have the beginning of what becomes the basis of the Mexican economy for a very long time. So first of all, the introduction of a Spanish-style town. The central plaza or market square surrounded by government buildings and churches, so kind of like the buildings that would be the most important in a culture. The church, cultural homogenization, government buildings, political system, all surrounding the economic center, the marketplace. You had a grid as the street pattern that would have been introduced that did not necessarily work well with the physical geography. You would have always had a military force. So if you look up and down California, for example, there was always a mission and a presidio. So a mission being the cultural center and the presidio being the military center. And they were built together throughout the Spanish-dominated parts of California. And they're built together for a reason. Think about it. One is cultural control, one is physical control. And they always would have located their settlements near good agricultural land and good fresh water. I mean, what were they here for? They were here to dominate the economy. Roman Catholic religion was introduced, we know that, and the Spanish language is introduced and becomes the dominant language in the area. So you have these what are called haciendas. So a hacienda is a Spanish institution. It is basically the plantation. So we are familiar with plantations here in the US. If you go through the American South, for example, you would have plantations. So hacienda is the Spanish version of the plantation, where you have a large agricultural area, one person who controls that, right? The plantation owner, the El Jefe of the area, and then you're going to have multiple people living on that land. In the US, on the plantations, it would have been enslaved African Americans, or Africans, later African Americans. And in Mexico, it would have been enslaved American Indians, it would have been enslaved Africans. Eventually, it would have been people who were not officially enslaved, but it looked a lot like enslavement, if that makes sense. So you can have a system that says we don't have institutionalized slavery, but you can also have a system of classism where you have one portion of the population that owns the majority of wealth and land, and the majority of the population that doesn't own anything, and their only way of surviving is by working that land. So it's not slavery, but it's also not freedom, right? So we have this land ownership that would have been granted to you by the Spanish kingdom. So the Spanish monarchy granted people land ownership, and this was a way of getting Spaniards to Mexico and Mexico, remember, at the time would have included California, it included Texas, it included New Mexico, like all of these states up here that are closest to Mexico were included in the Spanish Mexico colony. So how do you get people from Spain to go to the middle of nowhere? Because it would have been the middle of nowhere. It would have been a world away from what you were familiar with in Spain. And you wouldn't have been able to easily go back and forth. Basically, if you went to Mexico, you stayed in Mexico for the rest of your life. So it wasn't going to be wealthy Spaniards that were sent to Mexico or that were incentivized to go to Mexico. It would have been lower middle class people. It would have been people who were never going to be big landowners in Spain. Big landowners in Spain and wealthy people in Spain were going to stay in Spain. They didn't have to uproot their life and go somewhere else. They could stay in a luxurious life in Spain. So it would have been people who would be like the equivalent of somebody like managing Blenders today, or managing like a Foot Locker or something. There's nothing wrong with managing a Foot Locker, but there's a lot of room for upward mobility. And so if we have somebody who has a lot of room for upward mobility, they might be thirsty enough to go somewhere like the middle of nowhere, which is what Mexico would have been at that time, and uproot their life because they would have been promised basically a gigantic piece of land. So to give you an idea of how big these Spanish land grants were, one went from Santa Barbara to Ojai. One was Oakland, Richmond, and Berkeley, those three cities. Each of those cities have about 200,000 people apiece in them today. To give you an idea of how big, that's one land grant to one family. So that's the kind of incentive being given to people who, they wouldn't have been Spanish peasants, but they wouldn't have been upper class people in Spain either. They would have been those lower middle class, maybe like a shop owner, maybe, like the master of the house from Les Miserables, if anybody gets that reference. It would have been somebody who was okay, like they weren't very, very poor, but they weren't very wealthy either. So we have people who are granted these huge estates. They're given a lot of prestige in this new country, a very comfortable lifestyle. They would have had indigenous people, African people, a mixture of people working on as peasants on their gigantic land grants. And that would have been the basis of what eventually becomes independent Mexico. So just imagine that. Excuse me. Just imagine what that would look like. Essentially a country that has been taken over by a foreign country, right? Spain, comes in, annihilates a lot of the population, introduces new people, gives land to people from Spain, who then come and control these huge haciendas and create basically this class system where the Spanish landowners are the wealthy. They would have been in charge of the political system. They would have had voting rights. They would have been the people who taxed and benefited from those taxes. And a majority of people who were pretty poor and almost enslaved. So you would have had a very, very stratified structure to that new country based on this new economic system of the hacienda system. And the hacienda system, what were they producing? They were producing goods for Spain, tobacco, cotton, all of these things that would have just made Spain wealthier. And the hacienda system would have looked something like this, where you had this idealized colonial layout here in the middle. You would have had the market, the center. It would have been controlled by government buildings and by a church. You would have had the center of the cultural institution here as well. And then as you got out further, we see maybe the merchants in this city. And then as we get out here, we get into the urban fringe, the isolated houses, and into the haciendas. So then you have independence, and Mexican independence kind of comes in a couple of different waves. So 1821 is when the original Mexican independence comes into play, where okay, so what happens is by Mexican independence, I mean, the country becomes independent from Spain, right? But it happens in a couple of different phases. So first, you had this Spanish colony like Mexico, and there was many other Spanish colonies throughout the Americas. But France occupies Spain for a period of time. So because of that, they also occupy their colonies. So you see all of these different colonies throughout New Spain. That's Spanish controlled Americas, right? You see all of them start to rebel against French rule. And then you also see people who start to rebel against Spanish colonization. So there's a couple of different things happening here. One is that the era of American colonization was coming to an end. To colonize a different part of the world, it's a financial institution. You're taking over a part of the world so that you can control their resources to make yourself wealthier. You're basically taking care of that place. You're setting up a political system, a government system. Excuse me. You're going to have a few people who are in elite positions in that place, but that country, that colony, is going to be a subsidiary part of your larger country. And so that is always going to come to an end. Whether it becomes too expensive for the colonizer, which happens a lot, like Australia, for example. Australia never fought a war for independence. Essentially, it became too expensive for the British to continue to control Australia. So what they did is they made Australia part of the Commonwealth, where Australia never picked up and said, we don't want you here anymore. They never had their war for independence. They essentially just went from being a colony to being too expensive. So now they became an independent country, but they were still part of the Commonwealth, which gives Australia some benefits. Like I can live in Canada, I can live in, where else can I live? I think I can live in India. India is part of the Commonwealth. New Zealand, I can live in New Zealand. Interestingly enough, I can live in Britain for only 2 years. So I can live in other parts of the Commonwealth forever, but Britain is like just 2 years. So it gives you some benefits to be part of a Commonwealth, but really it's a way for the colonizer to say, all right, we've reached an end to where you are actually economically profitable for us, but we'd still like to keep some good relations because there might be some things that we can use. For example, when Britain went to war in World War I and World War II, the Commonwealth went to war as well. So as soon as the British went to war with Germany in World War II, Canada was there, New Zealand was there, Australia was there, India was there. So that's one way that these colonies became independent. Another was through independence, which we're very familiar with here in the US. So you had Spanish independence, or sorry, Mexican independence from Spain in 1821, and pretty much the next 100 years in Latin America is dominated by independent movements from different countries all throughout South America, Middle America. So all through Latin America, basically between 1820 and 1920, you see the majority of countries become independent from their colonizer. And there's a combination of things that are happening here. It becomes too expensive to have these colonies. There's another dominant political force that's growing, that's the US at this time as well, that's like basically encouraging Europe to leave the Americas so that they can control the Americas. But that's another story. So we have the independent movement, and it was a result of the French occupying the Spanish colonies, but it was also a rebellion based on people demanding redistribution of land away from the hacienda system and racial equality. So interestingly enough, the independence that's actually won eventually are royalists. Those royalists win in Mexico, and essentially they create a system that looks exactly like the system that was there during the colonial period, but it isn't the colonial period. So you have the people who own the haciendas, what we could call the landed elite, the people who own the land, so they're the elite. They're the ones who eventually throw the Spanish and the French out, and they're like, all right, so now this is going to be our country. We already own the majority of the land. Now it's ours, and we're not sending any revenue back to Spain anymore. We're just going to keep it. So now we're going to be the people who really profit from this land. So nothing really changes. The political system doesn't really change. The economic system doesn't really change. The social structure doesn't change. Basically, it goes from being a Spanish colony where a few people own the majority of the land and the majority of people work it, to an independent country where a few people own the land and the majority of people work it. And they even keep in these old ideas, so it becomes an independent constitutional monarchy. And you still have this system of social hierarchy where Mexicans of Spanish descent are equal to Spaniards. They're considered equal to Spaniards under the law, whereas people with mixed blood, people who are indigenous, people who are African, or people who are a mixture of all of those, were given lesser rights in the political system, lesser rights to the economy. Eventually, this is the perfect recipe for a revolution, right? So within 100 years, they have a revolution. And that happens, by the way, all through the Americas. If you look at the Americas, the majority of the wars for independence, including here in the US, are fought by the landed elite. They're fought by idealists, yes, but they're also fought by people like Washington and Jefferson, who own gigantic plantations full of enslaved people. And so what they're essentially doing is taking profit that would have been sent back to the colonizer and keeping it. And all of these countries, the majority of them, have that war for independence eventually followed by a revolution where the population, the majority of the population is like, this isn't working for us. That happens here. We call it the Civil War, right? It happens in Mexico as well with the Mexican Revolution, where it would have been people, basically the majority of the people, rising up against this institutionalized separatism and this economic system that benefited very few. So then we have a couple of things. So we had the revolution, and leads to economic instability. And then we have the Great Depression, and the Great Depression doesn't just affect the US here in the 1930s, it affects the entire world, and Mexico was strongly affected by it as well. But then in the 1940s, you begin to see something that's called the Mexican Miracle. So the Mexican Miracle begins in the 1940s. It is a whole collection of different things. So it's a collection, first of all, you have the creation of a single dominant political party that reduces political turmoil. Nationalization of oil happens in 1938. You have, in the 1920s, the Mexican government, after the revolution, started to really put a whole bunch of money into primary education. So in the 1920s, you have this real commitment to primary education, so literacy goes up. And when the 1940s come along and World War II comes along, Mexico, just like the US, really benefits off of World War II. So if you know anything about the US and their history and their growth in our economy, World War II really bolsters it. So it puts a lot of people to work making munitions and other things for both the European theater and the Japanese theater, the Pacific theater, or the Japanese theater, the Pacific theater. So Mexico also is growing food for and manufacturing for the war effort. So they make a whole lot of money, just like the US does. And because they had invested money into primary education in the 1920s, basically the 1920s going into the 1940s, now this whole generation of people who would have previously been illiterate, is literate, is able to take over this growing economy. So remember when we've talked in this class about the power of education, and when we have kind of discussed whether we should educate our population at all, well, a big part of it is it's the fuel for your economy in the next generation. If you don't have a population of people who are literate, who have a basic understanding of education, educational properties, they're not going to be able to inherit an economy successfully. So the 1940s, we see a real growth in the economy. We see further investment in the 1940s in higher education. A whole lot of engineers, scientists, social scientists were trained in Mexico at the time. The Mexican government began paying off any foreign debts that they had, so that brought in a whole lot of renewed interest in the country. You had people who wanted to do business with Mexico because the manufacturing had grown as a result of World War II. They had a good educated population. They didn't owe any money to anybody. They were doing really, really well. And they followed something called import substitution industrialization. So import substitution industrialization is something that a lot of colonies went through. So if a colony is there primarily to support the colonizer with raw resources, mineral goods, agriculture, stuff like that, well, then when they become independent, they're going to be still dependent on other people for their manufacturing capabilities. So essentially, if you are just there as a subsidiary who supports a colony with stuff that you can grow and stuff that you can mine, then when you become independent, you're still going to be dependent on the rest of the world for manufactured goods. So import substitution industrialization is an attempt to get away from that. And some countries do it okay, and some countries don't do it very well. It depends on how much debt you get into. But what you're essentially trying to do is substitute your imports by industrializing. And we see that happen in Mexico in the 1940s as well. So on average, through the 1940s and into the 1950s, the Mexican economy is growing at 6%. It becomes a pretty strong economy. They continue to invest in things like education and infrastructure. A majority of the roads were were built in this time, and then later in the 1970s. And then the 1970s happened. So in the 1970s, we have something called the Yom Kippur War. And if you're thinking that sounds Jewish, it's because it is. It's not happening in Mexico, but as we have hopefully learned in geography, it doesn't matter if it's not happening here, it's still probably going to affect us. So in 1973, we have the Yom Kippur War in Israel and surrounding countries. And it lasts from the 6th of October to the 28th of October. It's pretty short, but it has huge effects on the world. So it's mostly over Sinai, which is like the pointy little part in between Egypt and Israel, the pointy little part. You know, Moses wandered through there for a good 40 years. And also kind of like the pointy part at the end of Israel as well. And then the Golan Heights are in the northern part of Israel. So Israel was a country, it became a country in 1948 and has attempted to expand in many different ways, like over and over and over again since then, and is still attempting to expand. And I go into Israel in my World Regional Geography class if you're interested in learning about all of that. But Golan is very important to Israel. Golan is about 30% of the water. So when they go in and take Golan from Syria, what they do is they take a lot of water from Syria, give it to Israel. It becomes an important strategic part of Israel's economic growth, agricultural growth, but it also becomes a very important part of what eventually happens to Syria. Syria then suffers a huge drought. It leads to political instability, and it leads to what we're seeing in Syria right now. So with the Yom Kippur War, the countries that are known as OPEC, so the what does OPEC stand for? Again, I always forget what OPEC stands for. Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, also called the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries. So it's specifically the countries in Southwest Asia and North Africa that have a lot of oil. And so OPEC, what they do after the Yom Kippur War is they embargo anyone who does business with Israel. So basically they say, we're tired of Israel. If you're doing business with Israel, then we're not going to sell you our oil. And a lot of the world does business with Israel, namely the US. So if you want to be friends with the US, who was the biggest economy in the world at the time, you were also probably friends with Israel. That's the way those kinds of friendships tend to work in political economic systems. So places like the US, places like Australia, and places like Mexico suddenly see the price of oil jump. And now this happens all over the world because of the embargo, but it's especially going to hit places like Mexico pretty hard. So the price of oil jumps globally by 300%, from $3 a barrel, which by the way is about where oil is right now, to $12 a barrel. And it leads to all kinds of things. You might think like, oh, well then oil was expensive. Well, what do we use oil for? It's the basis of our entire economy. It's not just the transportation of cars, it's the transportation of goods. It's a major ingredient in our agriculture. So what we see as a result of this is the entire economy of the world slow, and many places go into a recession, including here in the US. The 1970s US was not a prosperous time for multiple different reasons. So in Mexico, we see production decline. And we also see a couple of other things happening in the 1970s. There was illegal seizures by poor laborers in different parts of Mexico. Basically, you had poor laborers who were taking over humongous land, like plantations that still existed, and the president at the time was not really fighting it. And that's a whole other story that we could talk about, the rights of indigenous people to land and stuff like that. But what it did for the Mexican economy at the time was it eroded investment confidence. So you had Mexico getting hit from a lot of different things. It was getting hit from the OPEC oil embargo, the rising cost of oil, manufacturing declined, production declined. People didn't have as much money, so they weren't consuming as much. So money wasn't circulating around the economy. Plus you had these other things affecting the confidence investors had in the country. And then you had, as a result of that, capital flight. So we have a whole bunch of things happening to the Mexican economy. They're getting hit with the oil crisis. They're getting hit with some internal issues. They're getting hit with production decline, manufacturing decline. People aren't as likely to trust their money in Mexico because Mexico is starting to go into this spiral economically. And that's when you see capital flight. And capital flight is the kiss of death for an economy. What essentially happens is you have the people who have money in the country take their money out of the country. So when people who own a lot of money, have a lot of money, when those people start to see their home country declining, they will often take their money out of the banks and send it somewhere stable, which is a real harmful thing to an economy. And I have mentioned this before in class, so we'll just review it real fast. But essentially what happens is you have this bank system that's based on loaning people money. The reason they can loan that people money for mortgages and stuff like that, I know that I've said this in class before, is because you have other people keeping their money in the bank. If those people remove their money from the bank and send it to Switzerland or somewhere like that, now those banks don't have anything to balance themselves on. So capital flight can be the real kiss of death for an economy. So you start to see the peso devalued. 1976, it's devalued. Devaluing means to officially lower the value of the peso. It's devalued by 45% in 1976. You start to see external indebtedness. So remember in the 1940s, they had paid off all their foreign debts, but by the 1970s, they were indebted to a lot of different countries because their economy was going into decline. The government starts borrowing money from other people. Now they can't pay it back. Their money is inflating, their economy is inflating. The peso is becoming overvalued. Production becomes stagnant, and they start to become a net importer of food and other things. Now, this is really important because if you are producing the majority of what you use, and people are from your country are buying inside your country, you're keeping your money inside your country, inside your economy. That money is now circulating around your economy. And if people want to buy things from you, now you have money coming from outside the economy into your economy. When you see a switch from that sort of localized economy to now becoming a net importer, meaning you're importing more than you're exporting, that shows a whole lot of erosion in your economy. It essentially says that now you are taking all your money out of your country to buy things from other people. So you're not really seeing that revenue generated and regenerated in your economy. So we see falling oil prices, debt, massive capital flight. That's the 70s. So we were doing well in the 40s and the 50s. And then in the 1970s, bam, something that's an issue in another part of the world that we're not even worried about now is affecting the whole global economy. So in the 1980s, we continue to see inflation. The GDP barely grows from 83 to 1988. Investment falls, consumption falls, so you don't have people purchasing as much inside of a country. There's not as much going into local businesses, and the middle class really goes away. And the way that the middle class goes away is you have this inflation of the economy, right? Those wealthy people in the 1970s had taken their money out of the economy and sent it somewhere else. They were fine. Wealthy people stay fine. They move their money out of the country and they own land. And land, you're going to hang on to it long enough and it's going to have value. But the middle class, people who don't have a lot of land, who don't necessarily own a whole lot of that type of capital wealth. What they have is just plain old money in the bank. What happens when inflation comes along, when your money is devalued, is you lose your savings. And so you lose your savings. Let's say you have a nice little nest egg sitting in the bank, waiting there in case there's some sort of, I don't know, global pandemic. And your money starts to inflate. What happens is that's not worth nearly what it used to be worth. Plus, the wages that you're making are now going to be worth less. So you're making the same amount of money. Let's say you're making 20 pesos per hour, but now 20 pesos per hour doesn't equal the same buying power inside your country. So you're becoming poorer and poorer and poorer working the same job. To give you an idea of what happens in 1982 when the peso is devalued 3 different times, is 1 new peso is now equal to 1,000 old pesos. So let's say I have 10,000 pesos sitting in the bank, yay. After 1982, it's nothing. So what we see in the 1980s as a result of the OPEC oil embargo is the middle class is pretty much gone. You have a whole lot of very poor people and wealthy people left, but that middle class is gone. And the middle class is very important. They're important for economic stability, they're important for political stability, and they pretty much get pushed away in the 1980s. So then we have NAFTA. And NAFTA is part of these different neoliberal policies that come along that essentially say, okay, you suffering economies, you need some structural adjustment. What you need is to essentially take, so what you need is to essentially take what you have and open up trade. Take away any barriers to trade, any tariffs, any taxes, just encourage people to come do business in your country. Now, that can kind of sound good, except that what is taking away your tariff and your taxes going to do? Well, tariffs and taxes, when you're doing business in a different country, what they do is they add to your government's ability to support infrastructure, support education, for one. And you have to wonder why a person, or why a company, I should say, would go from their country to another country incentivized because of lack of tariffs. So the reason that you would do that is because you can get cheaper wages, cheaper environmental standards in this other place. So NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement that comes along in January of 1994, essentially is brought in as this structural adjustment phase that's supposed to help the economy of Mexico stabilize. But what happens is it opens up trade between Canada, the US, and Mexico. It takes away tariffs between those 3 countries. And what you see is the farming economy of Mexico just die. Basically, the government here in the US, our federal budget for agriculture is more than the entire Mexican federal budget. So what happens up here in the US is corn and other food like that floods into Mexico because they no longer have the tariffs, and they undersell Mexican produce. And they do that because some of our farm products are so heavily subsidized here that a farmer can sell them for almost nothing, and they're still going to make a big profit because they're getting money from the government. So we see the farming economy of Mexico just disappear. And when it disappears, you see a lot of people who would have been farmers, they're destabilized. Now remember, we've already lost our middle class. You have the beginning of rebellions like the Zapatista rebellion in southern Mexico and Chiapas. And you have farms here in the US who start to, and I know that I've said this before, but just repeating it, farms here in the US who start to advertise in Mexico and say, hey, farmers, you lost your job, come up here, we have plenty of farms. It's essentially the same thing that California farmers did during the Great Depression, when they flooded the market in California with cheap migrant laborers from Oklahoma and Arkansas. That's what the book The Grapes of Wrath is about. Well, what happens in the 1990s is American farmers here start to advertise all over Chiapas in southern Mexico and essentially say, come here, come work in the US. We have plenty of farm jobs. And what they're doing is they're flooding the market with cheap labor. And the added plus is what? that they're undocumented as well, that many people are undocumented as well. So now you have the added plus of not having to pay them the same as American laborers, and of those people being vulnerable to the INS basically throwing them back to Mexico and out of the country. And then we have the creation of maquiladoras all through northern Mexico here. These are factories, and I know we've talked about maquiladoras briefly, but just it has to do with our growth of the Mexican economy. So just to briefly go back over it, these are factories that are going to cater to American goods like Dell, like Volkswagen has a, I know that that's not American, but Volkswagen has a factory down here. I can't think of anything besides Volkswagen and Dell, but there are many, many, many things that are manufactured all along the border of Mexico. And that's because you can go right across into, so here's Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Mexico, two different cities right next to each other, where you have a good amount of maquiladoras, factories. And so you can use the cheap labor, you can use the cheap environmental standards, and then just bring it right back across the border to Arizona into this much higher market where people are going to have the expendable income and be able to pay for these goods that were made for a fraction of the price that they would have been made for here in the US. So we see our manufacturing core drain, our good union jobs, the jobs that stabilized places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, all the stuff that we saw in American factory, those jobs go to Mexico to take advantage of NAFTA, the taking away of tariffs, and the cheap labor and the cheap environmental standards. So that also opens up something that had already been happening here for a very long time. And by the way, tax breaks from NAFTA are expiring. So a lot of these people are picking up and moving to other parts of the world where the labor is cheaper still, and they're not getting the tax incentives. Like Dell, for example, not only did they not have tariffs that they had to deal with, but they also got tax incentives to be here in northern Mexico. They're basically moving to Vietnam or to other places where they're going to capitalize on cheap labor and leave these cities to the other main economy, which are drug cartels. So drug cartels have existed for decades. And there's a couple of different things that really strengthened the Mexican drug cartels. So for one, you all know cannabis, right? So cannabis, there's 3 different types of cannabis in the world. There's many different types now because they've been blended together in so many creative combinations, but there's indica and sativa. Indica coming from South Asia and sativa coming from here, from right here. And so the sativa that we would have seen like back in the day, like that I would have seen when I was young. And in the 1990s, a high school student and a college student in California, I would have seen this ditchweed, this weed that didn't sell for very much. You get like a pound for $100 sometimes. That would have been pretty cheap weed, but still, to give you an idea. And it would have gotten you high, but not super high, not like today. Nothing like today. Because that 8-foot tall ditchweed that grew it was a weed, right? Like it grew all over northern Mexico. What happens in the 1970s and 1980s, as you know from 13th, is the American war on drugs. And you guys all watched 13th, and you know that that was thinly veiled way to prosecute and persecute certain populations here, but it also led to the US government putting pressure on the Mexican government to basically kill all of the weed farms that would have been in northern Mexico. So you would have had all of just this wild, like outdoor weed growing all through northern Mexico, and it was all sprayed with DDT. And what it basically did is it forced weed inside. And when it forced weed inside, that's when we came up with this like botany miracle that we have today, which takes these different strands of weed and creates these really specified hybrids that are just incredible. Like this is a miracle of botany that we see today, what we have done with weed. And our weed farmers are some of the best botanists in the world, right? So that drug trade had been happening for a long time, but it really gets going when the US war on drugs gets going, puts pressure on Mexico. Mexico starts cracking down on weed farms. Weed goes inside, it becomes really, really strong, hybrid. And anytime we have an economy that is in demand, so remember, we've learned all about supply and demand, and that just because you make it illegal doesn't mean the demand goes away. When we make sex work illegal, does the demand go away? No. When we make drugs illegal, does the demand go away? No, of course not. It just means that somebody else controls it and profits off of it. So as we further criminalized things like weed here and other drugs here in the US, it leads to this growth in economic opportunity for illegal economies in Mexico. So first, our US war against drugs gives power to the drug cartels, because while we have this war against drugs that is a thinly veiled way of attacking people based on ethnicity and race, and if remember you learned that in 13th, if we have that here, what was I just going to say? We have our drugs here, thinly veiled racism. Oh, if we attack, if we have this war on drugs that's basically a thinly veiled attack on people of color, we're not going to take care of the real issue. And the real issue is the demand, and that people continue to demand things like cocaine. And who snorts cocaine? Who snorts cocaine? Cocaine is a wealthy person's drug. Cocaine is a very expensive drug. It's something that you see celebrated in wealthier parts of our economy and criminalized in other parts of our economy. So what happens is we have this war on drugs, but it's really not about drugs at all. So the drug demand keeps coming in. And so somebody steps in to fill that position for the demand, and those are the drug cartels. And then in the 1990s, we have the fall of Cali. And so this is Pablo Escobar. This is his cartel. And then Cali breaks off from Pablo Escobar's cartel. And these are the two very strong cartels in the 1990s, and they get taken apart by the DEA here. But that just, again, it hits the crime network, but it doesn't take care of the demand. So as long as you have the demand, somebody else is just going to rise up and control it. So as long as we wealthy people here in the US, demand cocaine for whatever reason, and as long as we demand weed, now weed's different because it's becoming more and more legalized here in the US, but for a long time we demanded weed and cocaine and heroin. And what happened is that demand was controlled by cartels, and those cartels benefited from the proximity to the US and from NAFTA. So the opening up basically of trade. So with the war on drugs and with the fall of these two major Colombian cartels, we have the growth of Mexican drug cartels. In 2007, for example, that's only 13 years ago, Mexican drug cartels controlled 90% of cocaine coming into the US. And for a while, they controlled 95% of weed in the US. Now, weed is becoming more and more legalized, so they're controlling it less and less. See the way that works? And then heroin and opioid addiction has also led to a real growth in drug cartels. So you probably have read about this in the news, that we have an opioid epidemic happening in this country right now. A lot of it came from overprescribing opioids. So people who had back pain, who had surgery, who had some kind of issue, you had doctors who were overprescribing opioids, and they would get addicted to those opioids. And a lot of people got addicted to those opioids, remained addicted. They're very expensive to buy the pharmaceutical drugs. So eventually you had people who were so addicted to these opioids that they switched to the cheap street version, which is heroin. So you had people who had back surgery, had knee surgery, were in some kind of an accident. They were prescribed opioids. They became addicted to opioids. Right now in this country, we have pharmaceutical countries who are being sued as a result of this. And so you have these people who become addicted to these opioids, can no longer afford the pharmaceutical brand, so they switch to street heroin. And guess who controls street heroin? The Mexican drug cartels. So our issues here in the US have led to the growth of a very strong economy in Mexico. And that economy is run by people who are not controlled by the government. So because they're not controlled by the government, they're beholden only to themselves. And the way that they control people is how? We know how they control people, through fear, through domination. And so you have a lot of people who are leaving Central America and Mexico right now because of the prevalence of violence in certain cities like Ciudad Juarez or Nogales, or all of these places that really saw a growth in their economy as a result of NAFTA, also saw a growth in their trade of illegal drugs and a growth in the control of drug cartels. And you have the control of these cartels extending to more than just these border cities. They're taking over parts of Mexico that were traditionally tourist economies, places like Acapulco, places like Cancun, not Cancun, not what I meant to say. And also I didn't say Acapulco very well. Need some water. So what's happening is a demand here is leading to a growth in a drug organization in another country. So among other things, you have people who are leaving Mexico and Central America today because of a bad economy, but also because of the prevalence of some of these illegal economies and how much control these illegal economies have over entire parts of countries, like Honduras, for example. And I said Honduras has been the murder capital of the world several times. If we look at Honduras in the last 10 years, several of those 10 years, they're going to have the highest or close to the highest number of murders per capita in their country. That's a result of this. That's a result of demand for drugs here and a growth of an illegal economy in another part of the world. And so what it's leading to is a lot of people who are migrating and migrating away from the drug violence. They're migrating as a result of a poor economy and also as a result of the drug violence. So our response here is to build a wall. And I really wonder about this response, because it seems like if we are concerned with the issue, and by the way, undocumented people here in the US are only about 3% of the US population, and the majority of those people are people who overstay their visas. So they're people who come here on a visa and overstay that visa. It's not actually a huge part of our population that is people who have come here across the border. So why would we put money, and we're talking about trillions of dollars, not billions, but the border wall that Trump, for example, proposed was something like $1.3 trillion. Why would we put so much money into that when it seems that the real issue is the cartels? Why aren't we putting money? And I know you might say something like, well, there is the DEA and there's a lot and they're so big. Yeah, they're so big because they're powerful. They're financially powerful. I would argue that the reason that we're putting money into migration and building walls instead of dealing with the illegal trafficking of drugs is because, one, it's a huge moneymaker, and two, the problem is in the demand. And if we really want to look at the problem of the demand, that's a whole other issue. It's much easier for us to rally around people. This is a common form of migration you see through Central America now and Mexico, where people ride on the tops of cargo trains. So I want you all to question, as we're getting close to the end of the semester, why we do certain things. Because if we have issues with undocumented workers or undocumented people here in the US, why are we attacking the individuals instead of attacking the actual issues? If people weren't demanding cocaine here, it wouldn't lead to a growth in this illegal economy that leads to a dominant culture of violence in certain places that leads to people coming here. So if we were really concerned with that, shouldn't we be concerned with the demand for that illegal economy more than the result of that demand, which is in some cases this happening right here? It's the same question that I always think when I see people who are rallying against abortion and they want to end abortion, but they want to do it by making it illegal instead of the statistically proven way. The statistically proven way to end abortion is to have lots of access to birth control. So if we're really wanting to end abortion, Why isn't birth control everywhere? Why isn't it cheap and easy to get? It always makes me question, is our concern really about these things at all? Is our concern building a wall really about undocumented workers? And is our concern making abortion illegal really about abortion? So I want you to think about that. I have a little video on La Bestia, the beast, which is what this train is referred to, that I want you to watch on Canvas and let me know what you think. And we have one more lecture on urban geography, and then that's it for this semester. And you guys have told me that you want to have a multiple choice test. There's only been one person who said that they want to have a short essay test, so it's going to be multiple choice. Hopefully you've read my emails. All right, my voice is pretty much gone from doing these lectures online and Zoom meetings all day, so bye.